Assalamu alaikum. My name is Fadwa Wazwaz. I wanted to do a presentation today. Before I begin, I just want to mention that I've been recovering from an illness, so I'm feeling much better now, but I will occasionally need to just pause and just catch my breath a little bit. I'm going to be reviewing today a book by Patricia Evans. It's called The Verbally Abusive Relationship: How to Recognize It and How to Respond. Now, in her discussions, she mainly focuses on this particular book. Let me just explain that because she has many versions of the book. I have the 1992 version because as I mentioned before in some of my articles, I used to read a lot of these self-help books and read quite a lot. So in her book, she talks about evaluating your own experience, two kinds of power, broad perspective, personal power, the abuser, the consequences of verbal abuse, excuse me, the partner's feelings, obstacles and indicators, characteristics and categories of verbal abuse, the anger addict, conditioning, and the partner, the recognition of verbal abuse and asking for a change, responding with impact to verbal abuse, recovery, looking back, and the underlying dynamics, some reasons why. I'm not going to go over through the whole book and all of these categories, but like I said, I got this around, I believe, 1992. And I mentioned this because this is not aimed at anyone in particular, but a particular chapter that I want to discuss today. And I'll be paraphrasing what she says mainly, but I like to let people know what the sources of my reading is. Now, at that time in my age, I should say, if somebody had PhD and they were had a network of experiences, and for example, her network with battered shelters, network with abuse, the whole network of many different, for example, aspects of looking at abuse and healing. And so you looked at it kind of as a way, if you will, how a child looks at their parent, you're assuming they know everything, and you had that kind of mindset. Not that I disagree with them 100% now, but over time, some of my ideas, as I had said in some of the blogs, like the Reflections on Healing, has started to then change. And here I'm just taking us back to 1992, is around 2000 when I decided to sort of look at things differently, and so in stages then I went in a different, more holistic understanding of healing and trauma and faith, if you will. But here in chapter 17 of her book, 1992 versions, page 160, she talks about I apologize. The underlying dynamics, some reasons why. I just need to take a small drink. She begins with a quote in the chapter, and she says, it's a quote, Henry James, "The Beast in the Jungle." And if I could read that quote, then I would like to use that quote and sort of give my new perception of how I see things. And her perception at the time, Patricia Evans, quoting Henry James, The Peace in the Jungle, which I agreed in 1992 with. I had assumed, again, somebody had a PhD. It means their knowledge was knowledge. And, you looked at it again like a child looked at their parent teaching them something. To quote, he had never thought of her. Ah, how it usually glared at him. But in the chill of his egotism and the light of her use, this horror of waking, this was knowledge, knowledge under the breath of which the very tears of his eyes seemed to freeze. Henry James, The Beast in the Jungle. And, it's about the abuser's lack of empathy, lack of compassion, lack of conscience, you will, like to notice the victim, how, they were abusing the victim, how it was impacting the victim, how she was not heard. And at the time, you're also like listening to a lot of feminist movements who are talking about, for example, women's rights and versus like patriarchy and that perception of reality. And you kind of nodded your head because you saw lived experiences of people who are abused. And so you assume like that's correct perception of it. So now if I can just take that same quote and say, they had never thought of God and how it hugely glared at them. But in the chill of their egotism and light of the other's use, this horror of waking, this was knowledge, knowledge under the breath of which the very tears of their eyes seemed to freeze. So over time, my perception was you cannot really teach the abuser to notice your humanity, but rather you can place the greatness of God before the abuser. Now, they may not, as I mentioned the quote, think of God or be conscious of God or remember God. But by continually putting God before the abuser, that there is one to call you to account, that there's one who has power over you, as I had mentioned, then you're fulfilling like your obligations of calling people to guidance. You're fulfilling your obligations of conveying to people that there is one who has power that will call you to account. Then the argument has been proved true against them. And this is where I mentioned, I began this theme on Facebook around this time. And I mentioned, in everyone's soul, everyone knows the confident. So when you're placing God before somebody, and I don't mean again, like that, not to mock any particular faith group, but like some individuals harass you, call you on your phone or come to your door and harass you. I'm not saying it this way, but I'm saying it like in a way that where you're responding to individuals who are justifying abuse, or justifying oppression, to let them know that the decisions they make, whether it's about themselves or others, that there is one who will call them to account, and it does have an impact on their hereafter. That's in areas where you don't have power to stop them. Here she mentions that no two abusive relationships are exactly alike. So sometimes taking one abusive relationship and then generalizing across, a town or across history or even globally is generalization is just not, it's just pure nonsense. But we can learn some of the underlying dynamics. And she quotes in this particular chapter, Alice Miller and Karen Horney's research. So their analysis in this particular chapter, just to give you briefly, because I'm not going to go over the whole book, that there is a reality 1 and a reality 2. Reality 1, both the victim and the abuser, excuse me, both the victim and the abuser, or I'm going to say offender, and the victim, they both grew up in reality 1. She calls it like they both had an experience of abuse. Both had an experience where they were abused, where they faced, oppression. However, the difference between the two, this is her analysis, again, I'm going to quickly paraphrase, is the victim experienced a compassionate witness, like, a friend. And this is where I mentioned it also because another scholar mentioned it in psychology about the compassionate witness. So here she says that the victim experienced somewhere in their journey of oppression a compassionate witness, whereas the abuser never experienced a compassionate witness. And this is how they separated. One became an abuser and one became a victim. The absence of the victim made the absence of a witness made one an abuser and the other a victim. So she explains that all adults, for the victim, all adults were not wrong. This helped her to understand that oppression she was facing was wrong. Here she's using the she. But because someone was there to let her know that she suffered, that made her feel empathy and compassion for others. So let me point this out again. Because she knew that she suffered, this is her analysis, the victim, she had a witness that told her she suffered. She could therefore feel empathy and compassion for others. She did seek mutuality and understanding. Mutuality and understanding. The one thing she didn't know was why she suffered. And so this is why do bad things happen to good people? And there was a lot of conversations around that time, around that theme. Surely the one who said he loved her would not be so upset with her, would not yell at her, nor tell her what was wrong with her unless there was something wrong with the way she was or how she came across. She easily believed that she might have said or done something inadvertently or unconsciously that hurt her mate, just as she was hurting. She searched her soul for answers, and surely she thought he did also. The last thing she would ever have imagined was that he could not search for answers because he could not share her reality. And his reality is that supposedly he never found someone to tell him what he did was wrong. And so he assumed what he's doing is normal. And because that's what he experienced, and, as I said, if the heart, if it absorbs whatever social ill is around them, and unless it's connected to faith, then it will start to filter out whatever is going on in society. It will start to filter out based on what the faith directs you to filter out. Like you'll say, this is wrong, this is right. So if you depend upon people, then people can steer you to say this is right. and this is wrong, and it could be what they're telling you is right, is abuse. An example of that would be like, I recently posted something on Instagram. My daughter shared it with me. A woman, for example, was being harassed. So she told the person not to speak with her. So he went and shot her because he wanted to marry her if she rejected him. So he went and shot her. This isn't a Muslim country, by the way. And he went and shot her. And the guy that was upset about this case was going on saying that we have to recognize that this is a social illness. So again, the idea here is if we expect people to tell us what's right or what's wrong, even though you're reading the Quran and you're in a Muslim country, there can still be a social illness that can misapply, misunderstand, pollute the teachings of Islam with their own desires, with their own egoism, with their own issues that they have. And instead of you knowing the right direction to take, you end up harming yourself or harming others. So by turning to God, recognizing, that God has, set down commands and you have to follow, and turning to God, not with, again, to people, what they tell you, but turning to God, he will direct you because he's the director, and he will help you to obey the commands as he wants them to be obeyed. And he will help you to filter out what's right, what's wrong. This is where I came up with my analysis on taking God as your witness. It doesn't have to be during suffering and trials. In that particular article I mentioned, in trials and tribulations, but it could be general in life. There are many people calling you always in many directions. Taking God as your witness, he helps to direct you on the straight path. He helps to tell you what is right and what is wrong. Because otherwise you're going to be experiencing what he or she mentions about the difference between the offender and the victim. And you're going to be relying and depending on people to tell you what is right and what is wrong. And in her analysis, the abuser was never told the abuse that he suffered was wrong. And hence he believed it was normal, it was right, and that made him an abuser. Whereas the victim was told what she suffered was wrong. And hence that made her a victim, but she never went to reality 2, where she no longer needed to depend on the abuser accepting her. So that's her analysis. Now I'll explain, there's another layer to this, but just walk with me on the analysis. So we know, she says, again, I'm paraphrasing her writing. We know that abuse occurs to some extent in all but the most ideal of childhoods. Again, we know that abuse occurs to some extent. She's talking about verbal abuse in all but the most ideal of childhoods, leaving most with some uncertainty, some self-doubt. This self-doubt is greatly increased in an abusive relationship. For example, when the partner hears you're just trying to be right or you're taking it all wrong, what she's heard in childhood is reiterated in adulthood. It talks about the childhood wound, but this time without a sympathetic witness, this time behind closed doors. Clearly, when there's no witness to one's experience and no validation of one's reality, one must rely solely upon one's own feelings and judgment. And here's, again, where I talk about between egoism and conformity, because you then start to flip-flop. You go from seeking validation from outside, but then seeking validation from the self. This is difficult for anyone. It is doubly difficult for the abuser, or the victim, because the abuse itself diminishes her ability to trust her own feelings, and her own judgment. It diminishes her ability to trust her own feelings or her own judgment. Her feelings and judgment are constantly condemned by the abuse. So even if what you're experiencing may be like not 100% accurate, you have to still work with the person where they're at, which is they have to allow people to validate their perception. This is why if someone, for example, just say they think Fadwa is a liar and she's making stuff up. That's their perception. That's the reality. You have to allow them to own that. You have to allow them to own that perception and the reality, but you can't allow them to transgress in your boundaries and keep like shoving it in your face. So that people are entitled, for example, to say, I feel, or I experience Fadwa as, somebody who's not good in my life. They can have that experience, but they cannot then come into your boundaries and start to like implant their perception and their feelings and their understanding into you. Sometimes you are saying, we're trying to help you to see your mistake. No, you're trying to counter your perception of reality and your feelings into someone else. Someone may disagree with you, and they are also entitled to disagree with you. They're entitled to say that actually, I think you're the liar and you're the abuser, and hence, I'm not going to transgress your boundaries and shove that in your face. I'm not going to come and implant that in you. I'm going to, though, however, because I feel you are oppressing, you have to judge I have to accept my feelings, and you are lying, I'm going to go no contact. I'm going to believe my own judgment and just go no contact. So sometimes you could tell, as I mentioned, that somebody is not honest in their storytelling, is that they don't believe their own judgment. Like if you're saying somebody is bad and they're lying, then why would you contact them? Even the Quran says, stay away from people who, are not good for you. Like a liar is not going to be good for you. So if you think somebody is a liar and they're not honest, then why would you contact them? Via email, through third parties, phone, why would you contact them? You have to believe your own perception and judgment and validate it and act upon it. And one of the ways that you can tell that a person knows you're telling the truth is you believe yourself. First and foremost, you don't tell others to believe you, but you believe yourself. And you remove yourself from harm's way. Because what's a liar going to do? They're going to psychologically abuse you. And so this is the important lesson that sort of over time, it's like you have to believe yourself first before others can then start to believe you. So if you're constantly like running after somebody and they're going no contact, and you're saying, not that this person is good, that's why I'm running after them, but this person is bad, this person's a liar, this person is envious, is jealous, blah, 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 a whole list of things. And then you're running after them, it means you don't believe your own story. The victim of the abuse is taught to believe that although she's hurting, she shouldn't be. or that she's in some way responsible. From childhood, she's conditioned not to understand her feelings and so not to recognize the truth. This truth is that she's being abused and blamed for the abuse and for feeling bad about the abuse. And it's called, like, victim blaming. And the idea is not to internalize it. And the best way not to internalize it is if you turn to God. It's going to inspire you not to prove your humanity to others. He's going to break that. He's going to help you to break that cycle. Not to try to prove your humanity to others. And if you take him as your compassionate witness, he will help direct you to what is right and what is wrong. That way, if, for example, you're conditioned as a child, if you are conditioned as a child to not trust your feelings, to believe something is wrong with you, if you've heard that so many times, and so you're conditioned to blame yourself for the abuse, but you take God as your compassionate witness, he will direct you out of that. He will direct you emotionally, mentally, socially, out of that, if you will, psychological prison. He will get you out. This is where he will help you to understand the difference between healthy remorse and shame. He will help you to understand that. He will help you to separate the two. He will help you to understand how guilt leads to brainwashing. He will help you to understand why repentance, is actually a good thing. It's a form of self-love. Repentance to who? To God. He will help you to break out of that, and he will direct and keep directing you out, from that mental, psychological, if you will, prison that abuse and social illnesses sometimes put people in. The typical partner believed the abuser's denial and so became frustrated and confused, even while she searched for answers. Unable to reach clarity and understanding, the partner was left with feelings of inadequacy and confusion. If her mate was not wrong, if he was not lying, if she did take things wrong, then she could believe only that something must be wrong with the way she was, how she expressed herself, how she came across, or possibly with her feelings and experience of reality itself. Thus, the doubts of childhood rose up once more. She kept her mind open to what she might hear that would reveal what was wrong, why she suffered. Why do bad things happen to good people? She became, therefore, the perfect victim. The partner suffered many wrongs to her spirit, and she did not know the meaning of her pain. However, because she remained aware of her feelings, she was connected to the spirit of life at her center. I share, like Sami Yusuf, with the source. And here she refers to it as source of personal power. I later understood this as I said, not the self, but God. Try to connect not to yourself, but to God. Because the self, as I will just discuss right now briefly, actually takes you from oppression, and I will explain why I disagree with some of the ideas later on, into being like the oppressor. Eventually, it was the power of her feelings and the knowledge of her spirit which enabled her to recognize the abuse, and in doing so, gain reality to self-esteem. So here she's directing her from the reality of the abuser, reality one, or oppression, where they both, like the abuser and the victim, experienced abuse, and she's helping the abuser turn to the self and then to come out into reality too. And I'll give an example, and then I'll talk about how there are some issues that there's the admission. And if we sometimes just listen and respect people's opinion, but then if I really like the stories of the Quran because they're very complete. There is not this omission that you see in a lot of the stories and analysis that you see as they tell their stories. And I still, have her book, and I respect her ideas because I learned a lot from her. There's still some understanding that we can benefit from, even if we don't agree with the whole understanding. The typical abuser grew up in reality, one where power over and dominance prevailed. So he looked to the abuser, was abusing him or her, and that was like their role model. So I said, the first lesson of abusive power is what not to do. So also, as the case with the partner, many of his feelings were neither validated nor accepted. So that's what they had in common, the abuser and the victim. However, unlike the victim, he had no compassionate witness. Unlike the victim, he had no compassionate witness. Now, she's encouraging the witness to be another human being. And I'm directing people in that state to take the compassionate witness as God. But you don't really need to be in trials and tribulations. Generally, you should always try to have this sense of awareness, not that I am preaching that I am there, but calling myself first and foremost to do that, that God is witness over, and we have a lot of areas that we have to work on. When a compassionate witness, without a compassionate witness, my apologies, the abuser could conclude only that nothing was wrong. This is what I would like to say. Without an acknowledgement or an awareness that God is watching you and going to call you to account, and this is where I stopped in the Ba'ith, I said, and they denied the day of judgment. And they denied the day of judgment. And they deny, it's in the video, Al-Ba'id, the resurrector. So without an acknowledgement or an awareness of God, like I began with Henry James, I changed it into my understanding, never thought of God, you could have concluded that nothing was wrong. What you're doing, you're either following society, and society is telling you dominance, power over is right. And so you start to take the abuser as the role model. Instead of saying that what the abuser is doing is wrong and I don't want to do it, you start to take that as a role model and you want to be the abuser yourself. So if nothing was wrong at all, then all the feelings must not exist. So he even denies that he or she has painful feelings. You're talking about the reality of abuser with no witness. He closed him off from awareness as one would close a door, and he didn't know what he suffered. So this is like, for example, in the current case that I mentioned, where a man shot a woman 5 times. We have a responsibility to say something is wrong, because this is what God directed to. You can't say that, you can't just kind of leave it that you don't tell somebody that this is wrong. But they have to know that what is happening, what is taking place is wrong. That's your responsibility, is to know. Now, if you could stop them, you're supposed to stop them, like in terms of the police or those who knew, because it said that in that particular case, he told, I don't know where he wrote it on, but 2 days before that, he's going to be doing this. So if somebody read that and they know that he was going to be doing this, they should have stopped him. But the idea is that because you're looking to society and there's a social illness which somehow rationalizes or justifies this type of abuse, and it's not amplified that you're speaking up against this, that this is wrong, like there is not that social reprimand. And the person, the abuser, is not really connected to God, because even in a situation where everybody's doing something wrong, if you turn to God as your compassionate witness, he will direct you that this is wrong. So if you take God as your director, and then he will direct you, this is wrong, this is right, this is wrong, this is right. Otherwise, you're going to be prey. You're going to be prey to the social ills of society, because you're human. And you're going to be prey to whatever your ego tells you. And we all have faults, and we all have shortcomings, and our ego is not, it's not going to give us revelation. In this way, the abuser closes the door on part of himself. He becomes the injured and inured into reality one. So he doesn't have a conscience. And she explains this is how Hitler modeled his behavior after that of his brutal father. So too, the abuser modeled his behavior after his childhood abuser. So the abusers now become the role model. So the first lesson of abusive power is what not to do. And so this abuser then becomes adept at verbal abuse, and if given power, you can, say mental, emotional, social, spiritual. It's given religion, spiritual abuse, physical abuse. If you're given nuclear power, you can start carpet bombing at the slightest provocation, individuals. Without the knowledge of his feelings, of what he suffered, he could not experience empathy and compassion, and so could not cross the threshold into reality too. This reality was now behind closed doors. So this is her analysis. And so I want to briefly explain why I disagree, but I want to first share this information with you. Here she quotes Alice Miller, The Untouched Key. This is 1990, page 16. The absence or presence of a helping witness in childhood determines whether a mistreated child will become a despot who turns his repressed feelings of helplessness against others, or an artist who can tell about his or her suffering. I repeat that again and then explain why I started to then feel like, well, something about that doesn't sort of match reality. The absence or presence of a helping witness in childhood determines whether a mistreated child will become a despot who turns his repressed feelings of helplessness against others, or an artist who can tell about his or her suffering. I thought about that a bit. And, as a Palestinian, I said, well, this is not exactly accurate, because the Zionists, for the past 74 years, and even before that time, were plotting and planning to take over another people's land, kick them out. And not only have they had artists and, musicians, they went through the arts, movies, books, testimonies, talking about their suffering over and over and over and over. I recall in high school having to read stories about victims in the Holocaust, and yet they carpet bombed Gaza over and over and over again, and absolutely, totally lack of conscience that some individuals are being killed, injured, to a point of, it's like if they died, it'd probably be more merciful for them, because of the way that if you see the injuries, pretty bad injuries. And they know that, and they see that. And you can see the oppression and the ethnic cleansing ongoing, increasing And they're even like threatening of a second Nakba, whereas before they denied, they even threatened. So the more they talked and the more they were talked and the more they talked and the more they had witnesses and the more they turned it into arts and into music and into ballets, talking about their suffering and talking about their suffering some more and a little bit more, lots and lots more. Well, we're just seeing the oppression increase and increase and increase and the ethnic cleansing increase. We're not seeing it like the more they talk about how they were hurt and how they were abused and the pains and the tears, we're not seeing a transformation from abuser to victim to enlightenment, where they recognize the humanity and of others or the Palestinians. We're seeing, unless God stops them and brings them down to their knees, they are plotting and planning more ethnic cleansing campaigns and threatening with even a Holocaust. Like at times they're like, we're gonna mow you down. They're like, you show us your power. Through the, all you could do is scurry around like cockroaches. So that theory just did not seem to be, in line with reality. It was a nice theory, but something about that just sort of triggered something with me and said, well, it doesn't seem to match reality for me as a Palestinian. I sort of like walk through that road as like a woman listening and recognizing some of the, excuse me, social ills that we experience against women. And I had some issues with why people are not saying certain things are wrong when they need to really speak up and not make 101,000 excuses for why men cannot understand no, for why men cannot respect, walk away, even if someone is calling them, for why they're not nurtured, like Joseph, to be somebody who has a connection to God sincerely and truthfully. And you had that inside of you. And then as you started to read the Quran, I remember reading the story of Joseph, and I said, well, I see, here's a story. And Jacob is the father. He's a loving father. You know that because God told us he's someone who's compassionate, who's loving. If he was a bad father, when they came and he knew they were lying, the brothers came and they said the wolf ate him, and he knew they were lying. He said, your mind's made up a tale for you. And he relied on God. So who did he take as his compassionate witness when they came to lie to him? He trusted his feelings, but he took as a compassionate witness God. So he said, your mind's made up a lie for you. But he took God as his compassionate witness because he knew they were lying. He couldn't prove to them that they were lying because he needed like sufficient evidence, but he knew enough from the way they were telling the story. There were holes in the story. He knew from the way they were saying, like, for example, they came in nighttime, they were the crocodile tears. And the way that the shirt was presented, he knew that they were lying. The way, there sometimes you can tell, like I said, you don't need to run after them, but you just take God as your compassionate witness when you know somebody is not being honest and truthful with you. And we learn from that story again. It's a beautiful story. How to tell, how to turn to God as the compassionate witness, and he helps you to understand if someone is a truthful person or a dishonest person. And in that particular story here, they're all men, same ethnic group, same religion. There is no other, you could say, a compassionate father. So there is not that reality of abuse, oppression. Yet there is somebody who's a loving father, faithful, modeling the faith. We're not just speaking about somebody misapplying the faith here. Because sometimes we take these always the negative experiences, and we generalize them and we turn it into revelation. But it's a beautiful story, as God tells us. So here it is. There's even no experiences of abuse. And yet, one person, Joseph, is thrown in the well, excuse me. He's thrown in the well by his brothers. So here, like, I amplified the case of a man shooting a woman 5 times. And so then we start to generalize it. I used to in the past generalize these things. But here, in this particular situation, 5 brothers, who do they harm? Not a woman, but their brother. And they throw him in the well. And their role model was not an abuser, but a loving father. So here she said that Hitler modeled his behavior after that of his brutal father. But who did they model their behavior after? He was a loving father, faithful father, and he was a prophet. So from that, I started to realize there's a spiritual dimension to the story that we're telling others. In chapter 18 of the Quran, Surah Al-Kahf, God also gives us some insight also like about reality. It says, not by the way to take this knowledge and to, as I said, deny abuse, victims of abuse from their abuse. That's not the aim of the story, but to help victim of abuse see things a bit more clearly, or to help them turn to God so he can direct them out of that reality of abuse and let God be the director to tell them what is right, what is wrong, not to trust, not to put their hopes in people, but to put their hopes and trust in God. But in chapter 18, as I was just speaking, we know about the righteous parents, as God describes them, where the child also comes and he's not righteous. And Al-Khidr was told to, as a gift from God, as a mercy from God, to take the child and, return him back to God. Now we're speaking now, for example, about abortion, for example. Now, we also would even like Moses would question, like, why did you do something like this? And he told him, I know what you know not. Now, this is not for us to go and do something like this, but this tells us that there's a higher wisdom behind that, and a wisdom behind God's decisions. Like, again, why do bad things happen to good people? So it sends a message that, again, not to also assume that because God took someone at a young age, that their parents are righteous and they were abuser. We don't really know. It's the idea of we don't really know. You will be questioned. He will not be questioned. You, the human being, will be questioned. He, God, will not be questioned. But to understand that there is wisdom behind what God does, and he doesn't owe you an explanation behind that because he's God. Now, he might, in the Quran, the stories of the Quran, give you some wisdom to help us deal with the murmurs of our heart. And, as human beings, we need some sort of meaning behind certain actions and things that happen in life to help ground us. So he gives us some wisdom behind in some of these stories to help to ground us and to help nurture our trust that as God is directing and his divine plan is unfolding, and to have a good opinion of him. But to continue with the quote of Alice Miller, The Untouched Key, as you could see in the stories of the prophets, it kind of sheds, this may be true, but it's conjecture and that it's not complete. There are realities in stories where the parents are righteous parents and the child turned out to be unrighteous. Story of Noah, and I mentioned that in my book again. God intervenes between a person and their heart. The story of Noah, the father, very righteous, again, father, and the son didn't turn out to be righteous. Adam, Adam is a prophet, and he, modeled that he turned, to God in repentance and forgiveness. So here he's not even an abuser, and one of his sons killed his other son. So then this brought you to where I talked about trials and tribulations, the names of God, An-Nafi' wa Ad-Daarr is Allah. So it brings you to God if you start to look at it again and allow God to be the director. It brings you to An-Nafi' wa Ad-Daarr is Allah. Now, this again doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that you have to like the oppression. It just means that it directs you to turn to God, either to help you to remove that oppression or abuse, or to give credit where credit belongs. Like if God gave you some gift, to recognize that gift came from God, like that whatever it is that you have, that it came from God. And that if harm touched you, the one who harms or benefits whoever he wills, and he's the one whose wisdom may choose to use forceful corrections, like he may allow forceful corrections to discourage wrongful behavior. Or he has a wisdom behind why certain suffering takes place. And so it says, like in the Quran, chapter 6, verse 17, and if Allah should touch you with adversity, there is no remover of it except him. Sometimes the suffering is specifically just to push you to God. In the case of, for example, the victim, now again, like they're saying, look for a compassionate witness. But the Quran says very clearly that if Allah should touch you with adversity, here this victim is touched with adversity, there is no remover of it except him. Because the very wisdom behind that adversity is not to deny your feelings, but it's to push you to God. It may be that God knows that this is taking place, but instead of looking, for example, for you grew up in reality one, you experience abuse, either from your father, your mother, society, turn to God, he will remove it. Don't turn to yourself. Don't turn to looking for someone, savior, a knight in shining armor. And if he touches you with good, he is over all things competent. So that suffering, that reality one, is meant to bring you into seeking God, looking for someone to help you remove the distress. But again, the emphasis, there is no remover of it except him. In chapter 6, same chapter, this time verse 71, say, shall we invoke instead of Allah, God, that which neither benefits us or harms us, and be turned back on our heels after Allah has guided us? We would then be like the one whom the devils enticed to wander upon the earth confused. Remember how she talked about she was confused? She says she kept her mind open to what she might hear that would reveal what was wrong, why she suffered. She became therefore the perfect victim. Again, she kept her mind open to what she might hear that reveal what was wrong, why she suffered. She became, therefore, the perfect victim. The victim suffered many wrongs in her spirit, and she did not know the meaning of her pain. So she's searching for an understanding. And why did this happen? However, because she remained aware of her feelings, she was connected again. Now here they're directing people. Again, this is where I was talking about the self-help placebo, the spirit of the life at her center, the source of her personal power. And here they're talking about the self. But to get back to the verse, we would then be like the one whom the devils entice, because your mind is here open, and you're confused, you suffered all these wrongs. And so if you don't turn to God, we would then be like the one whom the devils entice. This opens the door for, conjecture. They're coming from every direction. Because people who are not connected to God, God tells us that he allows a devil to be their companion. And so as he confuses them, they will confuse you. We would then be like the one whom the devils entice to wander upon the earth confused. Why do bad things happen to good people? While he has companions inviting him to guidance, calling, come to us. Say, indeed, the guidance of Allah is the only guidance. And we have been commanded to surrender to the Lord of the worlds. Again, say, indeed, the guidance of God is the only guidance, and we have been commanded to submit to the Lord of the worlds. So by helping the victim turn to God, then God knows her reality, or she or he or whoever, he knows their reality. He knows things that are hidden. He knows things that are past history, things she or he disassociated from. He knows all of this. But by turning to God, in stages, God will take that person and help them out of that painful experience and direct them to, if you will, the journey of guidance and the journey of faith, or keep them grounded in the journey of guidance and the journey of faith. So the abuser feels, here she talks about, I'm going back to the book on underlying dynamics, some reasons why, the chapter, underlying dynamics in her book. So since the abuser feels justified in his behavior and seems to have no comprehension of its effects, and as I had mentioned, I gave an example, the Zionists and what they're doing to Palestine. They've written tons of books and movies about, they know what they're hurting, and they know how painful it was, and they know it was wrong, and they stand up and talk about how Hitler was wrong and everything he did and how he treated Jews, and they wrote the ladder of prejudice, and they talked about, they psychoanalyze it to the very T. And so they understand the comprehension of its effects. They know its impact on the mind, on the body, on how it hurts people. They know because they experienced it, and they wrote about it, and in arts and works, so they understand. So here she says, we can assume only that he's acting out his repressed feelings and is therefore acting compulsively. It's an assumption. At least she said we can assume. It's actually conjecture. They know what they're doing is wrong. They just are disconnected from God. Now, they may quote the Torah, but I don't think the Torah is telling them this. Just like someone quoting the Quran doesn't mean like the Quran is telling them this. In reality, they're disconnected from God. They're not turning to God as the director of their life, asking him to help them understand their book of guidance. Abusers, here she's correct, abusers seek power over. Because you don't turn to God, what does the self do? The self pushes you to seek power. What did Satan ask of God? He asked for power. Give me power. He called by the name of God the powerful. He asked by his powerful names. Give me power so I can show you that. Like God needs to be shown, but give me power so I can show you that Adam and his progeny are ungrateful. So abusers seek power. When you turn to the self, you seek what? You seek power. And the helpless, painful feelings of childhood must not exist, must not be felt, do exist, and if felt, are acted out. A long time ago, she's talking about the reality of the abuser. The abuser's childhood, who closed the door of these feelings, as I had just shown an example that there are quite a few cases where the abuser is very, very proficient in writing about their feelings and writing about what they suffered in details. And none of this really opened the doors of them feeling compassion for others. I mean, just do your own research and you could see that. Their feeling self, nonetheless, lived on behind closed door. This feeling self within was, psychologically speaking, locked away in a tomb of agony. Again, this is her analysis, and I encourage you to open your eyes to those who are oppressing. Would you say that they don't talk about the oppression that they've experienced in the past? If talking about it, writing about it, turning it into art heals you, why are so many abusers in all of these fields and they're not healed? There are singers who are abusers, for example. Why didn't singing about it heal them? The longer the child within is unrecognized, the more enraged it becomes, and consequently, the more rage the abuser acts out. So Alice Miller tells us, and here she's quoting her in the same chapter, as long as this child within is not allowed to become aware of what happened to him or her, a part of his or her emotional life will remain frozen. And sensitivity to the humiliation of childhood will therefore be dulled. All appeals to love, solidarity, and compassion will be useless if this crucial prerequisite of sympathy and understanding is missing. I tend to, again, disagree, and that at some point in time, I had agreed with that, but in my own journey, I think the best thing that helped, not to mention about, or my own journey is, I think, really turning to the Quran, because we're always in search of meaning. As she says, somebody when they ever experience anything, whether it's a divorce, whether it's oppression, whatever it is, your mind goes into this open state where you wonder what is wrong, why, what happened. And I think if you turn to the Quran, it gives you a more complete story of reality instead of conjecture. And it helps you to process your life experiences more accurately, more realistically. And it closes the door where, again, as God says, we would then be like the one whom the devils enticed to wander upon the earth, confused, while he had companions inviting him to guidance, calling, come to us, saying, indeed, the guidance of Allah is the only guidance, and we have been commanded to surrender to the Lord of the world. So it helps you to really come to realization that there's Joseph's story. I mean, people turned it into a romance story, but that was a major issue. But it's really a story about God. That even if you had a good role model, sometimes the suffering, the adversity is just meant to bring you into God. I mean, there's a lot of wisdom, and God shares that throughout many of the stories. And as you read the Quran, you may find the wisdom that might help you to understand for your own story. But by reading the Quran, it's a more complete storytelling. It's not conjecture that best helps you to heal your wounds and to heal the issues that you may be dealing with. But while I encourage people to write about their stuff, it is not to validate it for others. It is to find yourself on the map. Why? So that when you're reading the Quran, and you might find like somebody saying something that's very similar to what you said as you're doing your journaling. Their journal is supposed to be for you to know yourself so that you can know God as he's directing you on that journey. So it's not really to tell the world about how much you've suffered or, you know, how bad your oppressor was, but it's for you to figure out where you're at on your journey. And then for you to turn to God. As you're turning to the Quran, you're not going to always see that you were like, you know, the character that you fit was the prophets. You know, you have to be honest with ourselves. But it helps to direct you. That's why I said God is the director of our lives. Or I mentioned actually the supplication by Prophet Muhammad, not me. But he directs you by finding who you are, where you're at on the map. And then you're turning to God. Then he directs you. God directs you. He's like, well, here, you know, you're really like this character. You may want to like, you know, take a U-turn. Here, you're like this character. You may want to, you know, move away from that. You know, so he will direct you. He will tell you what's right, what's wrong, and he will help you if you first find yourself where you're at on the map and just turn to the Quran, which is more accurate in the perception of how reality is now, past, and what to expect from the future. So here she, you know, they continue on about the repressed feelings, and in her book about that those repressed feelings are the feelings of pain and powerlessness harbored since childhood are never dispelled. They only increase, and also so does the abusive behavior. But as I said, you know, if we look at a good case example in this day and age, you know, like I said, the Zionists in the state of Israel, none of those feelings are repressed. They're like, you know, first they denied, of course they denied, they said there was no Nakba, and now they're like, you know, remember the Nakba, where, you know, there's going to be a coming Nakba. So it's not repressed. They openly say death to the Arabs. Where is the compassion of their? If you go to any library and just look for the Holocaust, many books. So none of it is repressed. It's right there in front of you. They will tell you in detail, and they wrote about their pain and suffering, and they turned it into art and music, and not in a good way, but in a way that, you know, to ask empathy and compassion. Look at what happened to us. And they're right now, you know, planning to ethnically cleanse people in Yatta, Palestine, you know, where Al-Khalil is. Thousands of people, and they're seeing them in pain and suffering and tears. And as I began with the quote, if you're disconnected, I, of course, used in my own, I colored it with my own understanding. If you're disconnected from God, you know, this horror of waking, this was knowledge under the breath of which the tears, that you could, you know, in the chill of your egotism and light of their use. And this is how, when you're disconnected from God, God will seal your hearts. And you will not be able to see or feel any compassion. It doesn't matter how much you write about what happened to you. You will not be able to see the horror that you have become. Now, without admitting, they are taking the abusers. This is why I said they took the abusers as their role models. Now, they're not admitting because they're saying they're wrong. They're not saying Hitler is right. Like here in her analysis, she says that the abuser thinks that they're their role model in the sense that they're saying that what the abuser did is right and it's normal. And so they took them as that role model. No, they're saying Hitler is wrong. They're saying the Nazis are wrong. And they're writing the details of the hurt, the pain, the suffering in detail. But then look at the ethnic cleansing. It's ongoing. Look at the maps, of how much land they have annexed and stolen, and all the various laws they've made that seems to put a legal framework to the ethnic cleansing. So if the repressed feelings are no longer repressed, then somehow you become compassionate and happy and in solidarity with others. Well, why don't we see that? And that's the question that, early on when I was reading these things, I said, well, I know a lot of artists that will tell you in detail about their pain and suffering and their hurt. And they'll tell you their abuser is wrong. And they're abusing others. So in addition to the feelings of powerlessness, I'm reading from her book, many abusers have a deep buried feeling of guilt for having separated from their mothers. And here she talks about the wounds of the mothers. And again, it may be like there's some issues about that. The male only, however, who must completely break from the identification to become other than the female. The mother-son relationship is not psychologically sound. If these feelings are unresolved, the male may deem himself superior to that which he rejects and may hold in contempt all that is ascribed to the feminine. So sometimes she's trying to explain sexism, xenophobia, and there may be some truth to that. But again, if you turn to God as a director of your life, and what does the Quran teach us? To honor your mom, and what does the Prophet teach us? Your mother, your mother, your mother. So it may be true that the self, again, the egotism, because you have to break from everything like your mom, that umbilical cord, then it may be that the person has to feel like they have to be superior to everything that their mom represents. But again, if you turn to God as a director of your life and you take the Prophet as a role model, and then the Prophet says, your mother, your mother, your mother, and you have to treat your mother with compassion and love. So there may be some truth to that, but again, as it says, and if Allah should touch you with adversity, there's no remover of it except Him. So turning to the director of your life will help you to understand what's right and what's wrong. It will help you to not listen to your ego. That may be egotism coming within, but it will help you to overcome your ego instead of overcoming the mother-son relationship, which is not psychologically sound. In general, we may assume that the abuser has closed off and denied a complex and diverse assemblage of feelings. If his feelings are denied, he himself is denied. Who then is the abuser? To others, he's the hard to get to really know. To himself, he's who he thinks. Again, the ego here, who he thinks he is, the ideal image he takes himself to be. The abuser's sense of self is not grounded in the feelings of his being, but instead a fragile construction of mind devoid of personal power. Here she's talking again about personal power. And she describes it, it's felt as the ability to know, to choose, and to create from the ground of one's being. That is from the awareness of one's true feelings. Without personal power, talking about the self, the abuser constantly seeks to feel power over. And he feels, or she feels, dominant, of higher status, superior to the victim when he is or she is abusive. So some abusers even seem to crave, and this is, something that you will see, a euphoria of power over. And we saw that, and there's some truth to that, that this is literally how abusers are. Why? What's pushing them is I disagree. She's saying that by turning to the self, it would be better for them because then they can feel personal power. They wouldn't need to feel dominant over the others. And I disagree with that, because Satan turned to himself, his ego. And he wanted to feel dominant and superior to who? To Adam. I am better than him. So here I disagree with her analysis, because she's saying without that personal power, or without the power from the self, what I've seen right now, if we look at current day examples, is when people turn to themselves, to that personal power, what happens? They get this euphoria. You even see some people, like, they really get like, they're like, I won, this sense of euphoria of power over. Like I have power over you. And so they're not moved by their values or their principles. But again, they're moving by this turning to the self. Not only does the abuser hide his feelings from himself, and I have shown examples that some of these abusers, they don't hide their feelings. They go in detail. They'll say, I'm hurting, we're abused. They go in detail. It's not repressed at all. But they hide the abusive behavior from themselves. Like, they're not even telling themselves that they were abused. And again, I gave examples of people who are threatening, she's saying, like, not only does the abuser hide his feelings, but he also hides his abusive behavior. But, here they're threatening, like, let's flatten Gaza, let's do a Holocaust. And they're chanting. So if we say that it's because of abusive reality that what happened when the first Nakba happened, like they came out of the Holocaust and they're abusive. Okay, well, 74 years now. And recently the whole world watched the youth, chanting death to the Arabs, going into Arab towns, death to the Arabs, pepper spraying an elderly woman, clapping that a journalist was killed, in euphoria. Again, where she talks about this, they even seem to crave this euphoria of power over. This euphoria. And they're clapping. We just shot a journalist, walking around, clapping their hands. Yeah, did it. Target and assassinated a journalist. And you could see, if you look at the video, like, of some examples of it, this euphoria of power over. We assassinated a journalist. And they're not denying it. They're not denying their abusive behavior. They're not denying their feelings. And they're clapping. And they're then openly, death to the Arabs, and they're threatening. Just wait. There's the second Nakba is coming. Something to kind of reflect on is in the Quran Surah, again, directs us to better, more complete understanding of abuse and offender and victim. And it best helps the victim to really give them that meaning that the mind and the heart and the soul seeks when they experience abuse and oppression. The confirmed abuser can define himself. There was another part I wanted to mention. Here she gives a very good example. It's something for us to take into consideration, why we should turn to God as our judge and not the self or others. It's a very good example. She says, an example, an extremely tense, angry, and explosive abuser may describe himself as easygoing and relaxed. That's how they describe themselves. Sometimes people say like, Fadwa, why do you say like, that you have this flaw or that flaw? Because from learning from this, it's because I learned, they say like even Carl Jung says, what you say about yourself, the inverse is true. Once you accept your shadow, you don't project it on others. If I recognize my flaw, like let's just say my flaw is that I tend to get more angry than others. Doesn't mean that I'm gonna like resort, but it means that I will recognize that that is my flaw. In doing so, I don't project it on God and say, God, why are you angry? Or project it on others and say, why are you angry? I can recognize that I am angry and see myself more accurately. Doesn't make me less. People think like, oh, you hated yourself. No, I don't hate myself. It's because I respect myself and I want to see things accurately and correctly, that I don't want to project what's in me that's meant to ground me so that I don't become deluded and think that I'm the pious of the pious, that I have issues to work on, to help to also have a conversation with you. But you also have issues. You're just not aware of them. And so here she tells us that an extremely tense and angry explosive abuser may describe themselves as easygoing and relaxed. A critical judging abuser may describe themselves as accepting of everyone, taking people as they come. An undermining, trivializing, or coldly indifferent abuser may describe themselves as supportive of everything their partner does. A discountering abuser may describe themselves as very open to differing views. Again, a discountering abuser may describe themselves to open to differing views. They're like, they're always meddling. They give like a sugar-coating word to their meddling as nudging. No, you're not nudging, you're countering and discountering abuser. That's not nudging. You're a countering and discounting abuser. So they describe themselves, again, open to differing views. And she says here, Patricia Evans, I think this is very good. Many abusers describe themselves in the positive light of all of the above, while they indulge in all the categories of abuse. Why we cannot rely on our perception. Well, we have to turn to the director, because he will help us. If we write down, like, go to the Quran, he will help us to see our true selves. And he will help us to correct, and guide you. Because she has mentioned, again, abusers will describe themselves in the positive light. Like right now, the Zionists, how do they describe themselves? They're democratic. They sugarcoat ethnic cleansing as coexistence. Do they say that, we're ethnically cleansing people? I have never met a thief who said, I'm a thief. Or an abuser who said, I'm an abuser. The confirmed abuser can define themselves, I'm reading here from Patricia Evans' book, and the interpersonal reality so convincingly that the victim may accept his definitions. Such acceptance and trust increase her confusion. And this is a phenomenal comment, by the way. The confirmed abuser can define themselves and the interpersonal reality so convincingly that the victim may accept their definitions. Such acceptance and trust increase their confusion. What does this mean? This means, again, don't turn to people. They're not only conjecture, but the abuser is such a convincing liar that they will cause you to accept their definitions of abuse, what's right, what's wrong. As I mentioned in the Facebook post, that they will put you through this conversion therapy, and you will start to accept and trust and increase in confusion, because they will tell you, you know, this is right, this is wrong, and they will direct your life. This is something that we need to understand about why we should turn to the Quran and have God direct our life. Number one, we are going to be open, confused about what's happening to us, and we're looking for guidance. Number one. Number two, there are abusers who are so convincing in their abuse, in their definitions of why they abuse. And if you are somebody who experienced abuse, whether it is Islamophobia, domestic violence, whatever types of abuse, they are so convincing that they will steer you into what is right and what is wrong. You will accept it and trust it, increase you in misguidance and confusion. I'm getting very tired because I'm sick, so I'm gonna stop here. I will do the rest on this particular chapter, the underlying dynamics, some reasons why, that I apologize. I just have to stop because I'm getting really tired. So I hope this was beneficial. And as I started the chapter about the compassionate witness, we all need a witness in our lives and a director in our lives. And when we understand how an abuser works, and I think she does a good job of explaining, but the idea and the reasons behind it, I don't personally agree with. Like I said, when you read the Quran, it gives you other examples and wisdom for us to reflect on that might help us to shed some light and also bring us to the names of God. An-Nafi' wa Ad-Daarr is Allah. So I want to end with the verse that I shared. Shall we invoke besides Allah that which neither benefits us or harms us, and be turned back on our heels after Allah has guided us? We would then be like the one whom the devils entice to wander upon the earth, confused, while he has companions inviting him to guidance, calling, come to us, come to us. Say, indeed, the guidance of Allah is the only guidance, and we have been commanded to surrender to the Lord of the worlds. So thank you very much for listening, and I appreciate any feedback of errors or issues that I did not take into consideration. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.